Okay, we're recording. So, Bryant is here, Curry is online, Darby is here, Fisher not here, Hamilton is online, Elman is not here, Ashley is here in red, Crystal's online, Taylor's online, Chase is not here, Rollins is not here, Saunders is not here, Chamberlain is not here, and Vargas is not here. Look back online, make sure I didn't forget anybody. That's it. I'll give it a couple seconds, hopefully some people show up. So for our announcements, I'll just do some unimportant ones or redundant ones. So again, I see somebody's turned in some independent work papers. That's great. I do recommend it. Like I said, you're going to be at the bottom of my priority list, but I will try to get your stuff graded. And obviously, the sooner you get to the bottom of my priority list, the more likely it will be that I'll be able to grade your papers. What else? I guess that's it.
I do got a question.
Oh, good question.
So you can still turn it into independent work? It just won't be like, it
Yes,
won't be your top priority.
exactly. So same thing with like old labs too. Like if you have a lab that you need, some mistake you want to fix, anything that's past. Like I'm taking late work basically is the best way to put it. I take late work without penalty. The only problem is I might not be able to grade it because it is at the bottom of my priority list. And at this point in the semester, that probably won't matter to you. But the reason I say that is because somebody inevitably is going to be all of a sudden concerned about passing the class on the last weekend of class. And like, can I turn in all this stuff? I'm like, yeah, sure, you can turn it in, but I'm probably not going to be able to grade it. That happened to me one year, and they actually complained and went to the dean. You said you would grade it. Like, no, I have it in writing. I said I will try to grade it. So yes, I'm saying right now, I might not be able to grade it. But the sooner the better. It literally is, because everything's on the email, right? So everything is literally on a list. It's chronological. Every time I'm caught up on my list, and I drop back down into those things that are like late work and stuff like that. Great question. And of course, as you know, there's other ways to earn independent work, like doing study guides, watching videos, bringing in completely crushed cans. And of course, if you have questions about that and you need some details, email me and I'll give you those details. So we got Vargas that came in. I guess that's it. Make sure I'm not getting. Okay. So we'll jump back into it. Back into the evolution chapter. And to remind you, there's different types of evolution. And now we're finally getting into the different types of evolution. Now, we have talked about natural selection before, but now we're going to talk about it a little bit. Hold on, let's see what that noise is. Here with me, guys. Okay. Anyway, the first word for attendance is going to be, pull it up here. When I'm changing it up today, no, I guess I can't change it up. Never mind. 1 second. If I get it to pull up, we'll be all right. Anyway, yes. The first word for attendance is going to be key. So the usual stuff, but if you're online, not if you're online right now, but if you're watching the video later, send me a screenshot of me pointing to the word key, in addition to sending me the word key. Anyway, like I was saying, we're talking about natural selection again. And in my opinion, this is kind of where it gets a little bit more important for you guys as far as the exams are concerned. Let me look at it again and see what this noise is. Sorry, guys. Nothing. Okay. Just making noises for no reason. All right. So if you're online, guys, if you have a question, we've tested the mics before earlier today. So if you have a question, just use your microphone and say it. If you type it, I won't be able to see it. So anyway, back into natural selection. Hopefully we can finish this off today and start the new chapter next week. Your book, at least your old book, did point out that evolutionary change has been documented in thousands of scientific studies, right? So again, we know this is happening. Evolution is a fact. Now you can again argue where we came from. If you want to argue it didn't come from this, we have evidence to support it, but we've seen evidence, right? We've seen evolution in action. And your book gives some good examples of that. I won't be testing you on any examples, but you definitely should read the book. Your old textbook used a very good example of natural selection in action, which is pesticide resistance, which is what I think I've talked about this earlier, but I think I was talking about antibiotics when I was talking about it. But here's how it works. First, there's a small amount of poison that initially kills most insects, right? So let's say you're on a farm and, I don't know, you're growing corn, and there's a particular pest that's eating the corn, so you spray some insecticide. And what happens is, well, you killed most of the weak ones, but there are some of them that survive because there's something in their genes that allowed them to survive that initial dose of poison, right? And then those survivors are the ones that go on and reproduce. And therefore, they're passing along those genes. So in that second generation, right, now you have even stronger ones because they come from that strong stock that survived the initial spray of poison. Then you spray the poison again, and once again, you're wiping out all the weak ones, so to speak. And again, there are some that survive because of their genes. So basically, it's natural selection in action, right? You are helping moving it along. You're killing all the weak ones, and all the ones that can survive the poison are the ones that are surviving and reproducing. And then eventually, you get a whole population of insects that are completely resistant to the pesticide. So here's a visualization of it. This is from your old textbook. All right, so you can see there's this gene, and there's the green allele version and the red allele version. Apparently, the green allele version is susceptible to the poison. So you spray the pesticides. All the ones with the green allele die. So then the only thing you have left are the ones with the red alleles. And because they are immune to the pesticides, and because they have reproduced, then all the rest of their offspring are now immune to the pesticide. Make sense? Pretty simple. Not that I'm going to ask you any questions about this, but again, this is just a great example of how nature or natural selection and evolution does happen, right? This isn't some theory. And remember, theory actually means a bigger thing in science. It's not even just some hypothesis, right? We've seen this. This happens regularly. All right, let's talk about some key points of natural selection. This is important too. Very good for the exam. Natural selection is more of an editing process than a creative mechanism. I guess the one way I could say that in the context of something you might understand is the moth lab, right? So in the moth lab, no moths made any decisions, right? There was no decisions being made by moths. It's not like the moth said, oh crap, I'm being hunted by the predators, by these birds. I need to change my colors, right? No moths made any decision, right? This was all random. Randomly, one moth happened to have some offspring that happened to be dark. That was completely random, right? There wasn't any decisions being made there. And randomly, because those things were dark, and because it just happened to randomly be dark in that environment because of all this pollution, because of that, it just so happened that they had an advantage. So over time, randomly, that population changed from consisting of mostly light moths to mostly dark, right? That was an editing process. It was only editing what was already there. It wasn't creating anything, right? There was no, one more way to put this is, yes, those moths were under pressure by the birds, right, by the predators, but that pressure didn't lead them to make that change, right? No one made that change. No moths made that change. It was completely random. It was an editing process, not a creative mechanism. So again, on this bullet point, it can amplify or diminish only heritable traits. It can't create them. So that pressure from the birds didn't create the dark moths, right? There was light ones, there was dark ones. The light ones were diminished because at that point they had a disadvantage all of a sudden because of the pollution. And the dark ones were amplified, right? Nothing created the dark moths, it was just random. Right? So natural selection just amplified one, diminished the other. And then finally, this is also kind of a good key point, even though we don't talk about it too much, but organisms can acquire characteristics that help them survive, but acquired characteristics cannot be passed down to their offspring. Right? So, I don't know, if there's some gazelle in Africa that learns some good new trick, like jiggity jogging, to get rid of a lion that's chasing it, if that's something it learned, then that doesn't mean when it has its own babies, right, that when those babies are born, they're going to have that acquired move to help them survive, right? It has to be heritable. So again, another way of saying this, remember, none of the moths, I'm just using them from an example because you've already had that lab, none of the moths changed, right? No single moth went from light colored to dark colored. So again, acquired characteristics cannot be passed down. Oh, and sorry, and one more hypothetical example. Let's say, for instance, that one moth maybe there was a light-colored moth that flew too close to the smokestacks, and then it really was dark, but it had nothing to do with its genetics. It was just covered in soot. Now that, again, it would have a survival advantage. And because it has a survival advantage, it'll be more likely to pass along its gene, reproduce and pass along its genes. But its genes don't have anything to make it dark, right? Because it just acquired that characteristic. It just got disgusting because it flew into the smoke. So its offspring are not going to be dark, right? This is how it works. Its offspring are not going to be dark because it's not dark genetically. It's only dark because it got disgusting flying through the smoke. So any questions about that side? All right, another key point. Natural selection is not goal-directed. It does not lead to perfectly adapted organisms. That's an important one too. Humans are a great example, and I was telling you about that book from the last time we talked. I still haven't found it. It's somewhere in my house. I need to crack it open. But humans are a great example of that. There's a lot of things wrong with humans. And if we were perfectly adapted, it wouldn't be that way. And I know this sounds weird, but a good example of that might be like, I don't know, whales and dolphins, right? How many people, actually I don't know this. I wonder how many people die every year from choking, right? They're trying to eat, they're trying to drink, usually eat, and they choke and die, right? Because having your windpipe and your food pipe in the same pipe is a little bit dangerous. Now, whales don't have that problem, right? Because whales breathe out of a completely separate hole and eat out of a completely separate hole. So when you think about it, as weird as it might look for us humans to have it, if we were perfectly adapted, it might help to have a different eating hole versus breathing hole. Anyway, another thing, we're going to talk about this a little bit later too. A trait that is favorable in one situation might be useless or even detrimental in another circumstance. And I'll give you an example of that later as we talk about it more. But the point is, just because it's advantageous now doesn't mean it's going to be advantageous later. Actually, I'll give you another example now since we're talking about it already. The moths, going back to the moth idea. So let's assume, again, those dark moths had a survival advantage because they were dark, so they were camouflaged. Now let's assume, for some weird reason, I don't know what, maybe like a big war in Europe, let's assume that the Industrial Revolution was put to a stop one day, like all of a sudden, and there was no more smoke being put out. It rains a lot and everything becomes clean. Then all of a sudden, being dark is going back to being a disadvantage because now there's no smoke and soot everywhere. Therefore, you're going to be not camouflaged. Therefore, you're going to be eaten, right? So again, this is all random. It's not goal directed. If you have an advantage, if something has an advantage in one circumstance, it might not be advantageous in a different circumstance. Your textbook also gave this example. You can read about it. I'm not going to ask you anything about these finches or again any of the examples. But you should read about it because they are great examples. So your book talks about how there was these finches on the Galapagos Islands, and at some points, they had bigger beaks for bigger seeds, and at some points they had smaller beaks for smaller seeds. And your book talks about how the climate changed, right? So for one set of years there was a lot of rain, therefore there was really big seeds. Therefore, it was advantageous to have a big beak. And then later on there was a drought. Or maybe I got the dates backwards and it's vice versa, but whatever. Later on, there was a drought. Then we had a lot of smaller seeds. Therefore, having those big beads was a disadvantage, right? So again, what is advantageous at one point might be disadvantageous at another point. Because natural selection is not goal-oriented. This is all just random. You just randomly have an advantage or you randomly don't have an advantage. So that's it for now for natural selection. Anybody have any questions about natural selection? All right, let's talk about the other forms of mutation, the other forms of evolution. So again, like I said when we first started this chapter, there's evolution, which is how populations change. Then there's different ways that populations change. Natural selection is the big one. That's the one we talk about the most, but there are other ways. And this is the stuff that you're learning in this week's lab, or learned in this week's lab. Technically, you should be done with it. The next word for attendance, this time I won't even say it, I'll just circle it. So again, if you're in person, you can send these words for extra credit. If you're watching right now live, you need to send these words for your attendance. And if you're watching the video later sometime, you need to send a screenshot of me pointing at that word. Moving forward. So Darwin didn't know some things, right? He figured a lot of things out, but there were some things he didn't know. He didn't know how the variations that were the raw material for natural selection arise in the population. So again, using those moths as an example, not that he was the one studying the moths, but let's assume he was. He didn't know how, how do we go from having like all light colored moths to all of a sudden, boom, there's some dark ones. Where'd that come from? He didn't know that. He also didn't know how these variations were being passed along from parents to offspring. Which brings us to the next little point. He didn't know that Mendel had already figured that out. So remember, when we had the genetics chapter, I said that Mendel had figured all these things out, but he wasn't even known. Like, no one knew his work until after he had died. So yes, Mendel knew all this stuff, because Mendel was alive when Darwin was alive, but no one else did for the most part. So this was all new information. And remember, the best way your book puts it, when we were talking about the genetics chapter, back in the day, they thought everything was basically like incomplete dominance, right? So if you make a tall person and make a short person, you're going to get a middle person. Or if you make a blue flower or a red flower with a white flower, you're going to get a pink flower. If you make a black mouse with a white mouse, you're going to get a gray mouse, right? That's how they thought. Basically, they thought just everything was a blend of the parents. And we know now that's not the case, right? We know from that chapter that that's only incomplete dominance, right? Then there's complete dominance where if you made something, a black mouse and a white mouse, they might all be black if black is dominant. Or a red flower and a white flower, you might have a white flower with red spots if it's co-dominance, right? So again, Darwin didn't know all this stuff. Mendel did, but Darwin didn't know what Mendel did. Most people didn't know what Mendel knew at that point. So let's talk about the sources of genetic variation. Even though we've already talked about this, this is a good reminder. And I told you when you were learning it in that other chapter that this would come back. Well, it's coming back. Individual variations occurs in all species. So humans, we can definitely see it, right? Because humans are looking at other humans. So you can just look at another human and see the variation. This person's taller, this person's shorter, this person has a bigger nose, this person has a shorter nose, this person has bigger eyes, or that person has smaller eyes, right? You can see variations in humans. Some species it might be a little bit harder to see the variation if you're not studying them. Like if you look at grass, it's the same species of grass. You're probably like, yeah, that looks all the same to me. But there is variation. Anyway, yeah, like I said, especially when you think about humans, some of these physical differences are very obvious. But there's also some phenotypic variations that are observed on the molecular level. Again, using humans as an example. You can't look at somebody and say, oh, yeah, that person has sickle cell, right? You can't see by looking if someone has sickle cell. But that is a variation within the human population. And actually, we will talk about sickle cell again later in this chapter, so that's a good example. Also, it's worth noting that not all variation in a population is heritable. Have you guys ever seen those women in Africa? I forgot the name of the tribe, but they put those rings on, right? So that stretches their neck. I'm going to put a picture on that for the next semester. You can look it up if you want. Anyway, they put rings the same way that people put they get their ear pierced and it's larger and larger gauges, right? Same thing with these women, they stretch their neck. That's a variation in a population, but that's not heritable, right? I have a forearm tattoo. Do you guys have a forearm tattoo? That particular one? No, right? That's variation in the population, but it's not heritable, right? So again, it's all about being heritable with this variation. Yeah, which is what this bullet point is. So it's only the genetic components of variation that is relevant to natural selection. Any questions about that side? Here's an old picture, a picture from your old textbook. This is all the same species of snake. It's garter snakes. It's all, again, the same species, but you can see they look very different. It's hard to see. This projector kind of stinks in this lighting. But there is some variation there. And depending on different situations, like if this thing was living in a drier area, maybe in a more desert area, it would probably blend in better and hide from predators better. So it'd be more advantageous to look like that. Meanwhile, this thing might do better in the woods, right? And this thing would do worse in the woods. So again, it's that genetic variation that's the key to evolution or natural selection. So again, Darwin didn't know, and I'm just using the moths as an example because we're familiar with them. He didn't necessarily work with the moths. He didn't know where that first black moth came from. But we do, and the answer is mutations, and you need to know that. This is the bullet point you need to know. I'm going to get to it in a second. But new alleles originate by mutation. So that original population of moths that was all light colored, they all had the same allele for that gene. There was no variation for that gene. But then there was a mutation, and then all of a sudden, boom, we had some dark moths, right? That allele, that new allele, arose by mutation, right? So there was a mutation, and then all of a sudden we had this new allele, we had this new variation in the population. And as you should already know from the previous, I think last chapter, yes. What is a mutation? A mutation is a change in the nucleotide sequence of a DNA. So a mutation is where you change the code, right? The code that says this is how you build a protein. And again, what you need to know for the exam is there'll probably be a question on this, because I've said it twice, at least in 2 chapters, maybe 3. Mutations are the ultimate source of genetic variation that serves as raw material for evolution. So without mutations, we wouldn't have evolution, because everything would just be the same. Then we talk a little bit more about the difference between multicellular and singular organisms. In multicellular organisms, it's only mutations that in the cells that produce gametes that matter. So you guys have all had the 3rd exam. By the way, today's the last day if you take it, a true retake. Anyway, you've all had the third exam, and one of the questions is something about like getting hit by a nuclear blast. It does not work this way. So I don't think this is a real situation. But imagine you did get hit with a nuclear blast, but somehow you were in some safe place. I don't know, it's really thick lead wall. I don't know what it is, but you're safe. And you're hiding behind the wall, but your leg is sticking out. Right? So your leg gets hit with a nuclear blast. You're far enough away; it doesn't burn it, blow it off, or anything. But you do get a lot of radiation, and you get some mutations in the cells in your leg. But that's not going to affect you because your ovaries or your testicles did not get hit by that blast. Therefore, it doesn't matter if you have a mutation because you're not going to pass that mutation on, right? Only mutations that you can pass along matter. And then if you're a multicellular organism, it's only those that make the eggs or the sperm that matter. So, any questions about this slide? Okay, a change as small as a single nucleotide in a gene can have a significant effect on a phenotype. We already know that. I said that when I first told you about mutations, and I used this example when I first told you about mutations, and now it's coming back again. It's sickle cell disease. That's one single nucleotide, right? The whole gene, a bunch of letters, but there's one nucleotide that has this substitution, so that we swap one letter for the other. And because of that, it causes a whole disease, and I'm going to come back to that. Now, I'm not going to test you on this, but both your old textbook and your new textbook do a good job of pointing this out. Sorry, I just noticed this is on the wall. Not that it matters, because you guys are all in the right place, but I do not need you to go to H209. Anyway, a random change in an organism's DNA is not likely to improve its genome any more than randomly changing some words on a page are likely to improve the story. I guess what both of your textbooks are getting at here is, yes, mutations happen. A lot of times, they're just useless. And I'm going to come back to that later in this presentation. But basically, usually when there's a mutation, it's bad. Sometimes it's useless. Even more on more rare occasions, it's actually beneficial. So a mutation that affects a protein's function will probably be harmful. That's what I'm getting at, right? Generally speaking, a mutation is going to be bad. If you change the code and you change different amino acid, at least one, possibly more, then you're going to change the shape of the protein, therefore you're going to change its function, and that's usually bad. But on rare occasions, a mutated allele may improve the adaptation of an individual to its environment. It may enhance its reproductive success. And this is more likely when the environment is changing in such a way that mutations that were once disadvantageous are favorable under new conditions. First, we'll use some real life examples. First, we'll talk about the one we've already talked about. You should recognize this, not that I'm going to ask you on the exam, but you guys recognize what this picture is right here. Because we've talked about it in 3 different chapters now. And I just mentioned it a slide or 2 ago. No one recognizes what this picture is? It's a red blood cell that has sickle cell. Remember we were talking about how that's one mutation and it causes the whole disease? How about these things? Not this one, not these white ones here, but these red things. What are those things? Does anybody recognize those? Yeah, just regular blood cells, right? This is the sickle blood cell, so it's the one with disease. These are regular old blood cells that don't have sickle cells, so they're fine. And here, I don't really expect anybody to get this because I'm not showing it to you. But let's see anyway. Does anybody know what these things are? Those two things.
White blood cells.
Great guess, because we're talking about blood, and they are white. So technically, they are blood cells that are white. So yes, great guess. But what they actually are blood cells that have been infected with malaria. So what happens in malaria is, it's transferred by mosquitoes. The parasite gets inside your blood cells, like they have done here, and they reproduce inside your blood cells until there's so many of them that your blood cells explode. That's what's happened here, right? And then they go off and then infect other blood cells inside your body. That's what malaria is. So, as you guys might guess, malaria is bad. Malaria usually kills people, often kills people. But here's the change, right? So again, that's an advantageous thing, right? It's not good to have malaria. You're probably not going to survive, probably not going to reproduce. But all of a sudden, there was this genome, right? Or there was this mutation in the genome for somebody in Africa, and that gave them sickle cell disease, which we think of as the disease. And it is still a disease. It's still bad. It still has all these bad side effects. But sickle cells are less likely to be infected by malaria. Therefore, when that mutation first arose in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, where there's a lot of mosquitoes, there's a lot of malaria, all of a sudden what is a disease became an advantage. So that's why, if you were to look it up for independent work, people from African descent and other tropical places to like Southeast Asia, places like that, they are more likely per capita to have sickle cell disease than people of European descent, for example, because it's an advantage, right? So these people who have this disease, even going from way back, were more likely to survive. Therefore, they would be more likely to pass along the genes. Therefore, more people would have the sickle cell disease. Make sense? So that's a real example. And this is just some hypothetical example I'm coming up with. So imagine that there's somebody living today and they had something wrong with whatever gene, I don't know, something involved in their metabolism. And it turns out that, remember how I said, this was a test question and it might come back on the final. When you eat, 34% of that food, that energy is put to use, and the other is lost its heat. You guys remember that? If not, you should, because that might be on the final. It was a test question from exam 2. When you eat, 34% of that energy is put to use, as in making ATP. The other is lost its heat. So imagine you have a mutation, right? Say this guy has a mutation. And for some reason, when he eats, 88% of it is put to use, right? So this guy, when he eats calories, unlike you, a lot of them aren't getting burnt and put off his heat. They're getting put to use, right? They're making ATP. He's making fat. Right now, that's not good for him, right? He's fat. He's overweight. That's not healthy. He's not likely to survive. Well, he's less likely to survive because he's overweight and unhealthy. Therefore, he's going to be less likely to reproduce and pass along his genes. Therefore, that mutation would probably die off if that was ever a real mutation in the human genome or gene pool. However, imagine, we got we got the stuff in the Middle East going on. Iran starts getting involved, then we get involved with Iran, and China's like, hey, what are you doing? So they get involved with us. And then Taiwan says, okay, I'm getting in on this too, and so does Korea. Then all of a sudden we have World War III, and we start shooting off nuclear bombs, and now most of the human population is dead, and so is most of our food, right? We've blown away most of our farms. Now, all of a sudden, all the humans left on Earth are starving to death. Now, this guy has an advantage, right? Because humans, in my weird hypothetical apocalyptic example, are starving to death, and there's hardly any food to find. But when this guy finds food and he eats it, again, like I said, because of whatever mutation, he's storing all that food energy, and he's not releasing the rest of his heat energy. So again, just an example. Here's a real life example of how sometimes something that's a disadvantage can be an advantage. Here's some crazy hypothetical advantage or example of how having something that's a disadvantage can become an advantage. Anyway, back up and talk about what we're talking about here, or focus on what we're talking about here. We're talking about mutations, right? So here we are, we're talking about mutations. So again, what you need to know for the exam is usually mutation is bad, right? Sometimes mutation can be good. But we were talking about small mutations back then. Chromosomal mutations that delete, disrupt, or rearrange many genes at once are almost always certain to be harmful. So again, in the sickle cell example, that was one nucleotide being changed, right? That was a small change. In my hypothetical example, I said one gene was changed, right? But if you have a big thing, like, in crossing over, right? If you remember, crossing over happens in prophase 1 of meiosis. If in crossing over something goes wrong and a whole chunk of chromosome goes missing from this chromosome and gets stuck on the other chromosome, right? That's a lot of genes at once. And that's almost certain to be harmful. But your book does point out that duplications of a gene or small pieces of DNA through errors in meiosis can provide an important source of genetic variation and eventually lead to new genes with malfunctions. So basically, we're saying the same thing as I said on the last slide. Usually these things are harmful. Occasionally, they can be beneficial. And it's all random, right? It's random that the mutation comes up, and it's random if it's advantageous or not. Anyway, any questions about that slide? All right. Really quickly, I'm not going to test you on this, but we'll point this out. In prokaryotes, mutations quickly generate genetic variation, right? Because, well, there's a lot of reasons. Remember, prokaryotes are more basic life forms. We'll just, for the sake of this conversation, call them bacteria, because bacteria are prokaryotes. So in your mind, just think of bacteria, right? In bacteria, mutations generate quickly. Why? Well, because bacteria are haploid. Remember, they only have one single chromosome. So in us, every allele that you have two different versions, right? Or at least two different. You got one from your mom, one from your dad. So if one of those gets mutated, well, you still have the other normal one that you got from the other parent, right? Because we have these homologous genes. But bacteria, it's not that way, right? They've got the one chromosome. So if that one allele gets mutated, then that's it. That's all they have. So when they reproduce through mitosis, it's going to get passed along. For us, again, if you have a mutation in one of your alleles, they get segregated in meiosis. So there's a 50% chance when you produce or offer a sperm or an egg, 50% chance that you're going to pass along that mutation, 50% chance you're going to pass along the one that didn't get mutated. Also think about the fact that how quickly bacteria generate, right? They reproduce a lot. Anyway, I'm not going to test you on this. Just wanted to point that out. And again, like I've already said, really quickly talk about animals and plants. On average, there's about one mutation in every 100,000 genes. I'm going to put a question mark next to this because I'm not quite sure if I'm going to ask you this or not. But yes, on average, in animals and plants, there's one mutation in every 100,000 genes per generation. That's about how often it happens. Side note, too, that's also one of the ways they can kind of figure out how long a species has been around, right? Without getting too deep into it, they can look at the genome of a species now, compare it to the hypothesized ancestral species, right? We talked about speciation earlier in the chapter. And they can look at certain genes, like, all right, it's almost like clockwork. Like, this genome is this different than that genome. Based on the fact that we know that there's about one mutation every 100,000 genes per generation, we can then figure that this species deviated from that species X generations ago, right? Anyway, I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. Another thing about animals and plants, again, we're kind of comparing them to the prokaryotes, the bacteria we just talked about. We have a long time span between generations, right? We don't reproduce like bacteria, thank goodness. And again, like I've already mentioned before, animals and plants have diploid genomes, right? So we have two copies of every allele. So if one of our alleles gets mutated, there's a 50% chance that we're going to pass it along to the next generation. Any questions about that slide? All right. So again, we're still talking about the sources of genetic variation. We're almost done talking about the sources of genetic variation. The next thing we're talking about is sexual reproduction. We've already, talked a little bit about this when we talked about meiosis. Sexually reproducing organisms, I'm missing a word there. Sexually reproducing organisms, or insexually reproducing organisms. Most genetic variations in the population come from a unique combination of alleles in each individual inheritance, right? So it's all about the sex. Right? So just think about two parents having, I don't know, 4 kids. And those two parents having 4 kids, each one of those 4 kids is going to be slightly different, right? They're going to look maybe similar, but they are all each going to be individually different, right? So this is where we get this variation from. So a fresh assortment of existing alleles arises every generation from 3 random components. You do need to know this because I mentioned it in the previous chapter and it's coming back again, so you need to know this for the exam. Where does this variation come from when it comes to sexually reproducing organisms? These 3 components: independent assortment or orientation of homologous chromosomes. So again, to remind you, what that means is, let's just assume, oh, come on. Let's just assume this organism only has 3 sets of chromosomes. So what we're saying is, when they line up in meiosis, metaphase of meiosis, it could be that yes, all the mom chromosomes line up on one side and all the dad chromosomes line up on the other. That could happen. But the point being, for that first bullet point, is what we call independent assortment. Meaning, remember, it can be any which way. I'm not going to draw all the different versions out, but right, it's just all independent. They line up anyway. It's all random. There's no rhyme or reason as to which mom side, which dad side. Right? It just happens. That's independent assortment. And because of that, remember, there were 60. If you're looking at sperm cells, for example, if you were to look at any one of a male sperm, there's 64 trillion. What do we say? 64 million? 64 million different combinations, right? Of which mom version or dad version of the chromosome they got. So anyway, you need to know that bullet point. The second one is crossing over. So to remind you, crossing over happens in prophase. We already learned about that and you were testing on it recently, right? So in prophase, those homologous chromosomes get close together and they swap chunks, right? So you might have, let's try to draw it. You might have a dad chromosome with a mom chunk on it, and then a mom chromosome with a dad chunk on it. Let's see. Right? Because they get close to each other and they literally just swap parts. So that's crossing over, right? And again, it's completely random. And if you remember when we learned about it, sometimes it happens in one spot, sometimes it happens in multiple spots, sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Sometimes it's just a little spot, sometimes it's a big spot. It's all completely random. And then, of course, the idea of random fertilization, right? So you don't know which sperm are going out there. You don't know which eggs are going out there. It's all random. So any questions about that side? All right, the next word for attendance will be over. Same old stuff. If you're watching the video later, so not right now if you're on the live stream, but if you're watching the video later, take a screenshot of me pointing at the word over, send that in for the individual or for attendance. Any questions about this slide? All right, another very important thing, and I've seen people writing this question on the study guide and or the lab. I don't remember which one it was, but populations is the unit of evolution. You need to know that before you even talk about this. Again, I've already said this. Individuals do not evolve. Only populations change. Now, an individual might change, but that in itself, by definition, is not evolution, right? It's only evolution if the population changes. So, back to the side here. The evolutionary impact of natural selection, or any type of evolution, actually, is only apparent in the changes in a population over time, right? So it has to be a population changing, and it has to be over time. Again, using the moths as an example, I'll beat that dead horse. I'll stick with what's on the slide here. So, what is a population? This is also something you definitely need to know. So if you're taking notes, either write this down or at least make a note that you need to know this. This is going to come back in the later chapters too. We're going to define it a little bit differently in the other chapters, but you need to know what a population is. A population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area and interbreed. I guess I would just focus on the fact they live in the same area. So same species, same area. Of course, they're going to interbreed in that situation. Another thing that we don't talk about, like for some reason in this chapter, but later, another way we're going to define a population is a group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area that are dealing with the same thing, right? They're fighting for the same, competing for the same resources. They're dealing with the same climates, things like that, right? So all the squirrels on WVSU's campus, that's a population. The squirrels in Kanawha State Forest, that's a different population, right? Those, they're probably not getting together. They're probably not interbreeding, right? Because they're too far away. So make sure you know what population is. Different populations of the same species may be geographically isolated from each other. So again, like I said, the squirrels on WVSU's campus versus the squirrels in Kanawha State Forest, those are probably completely separate populations. Now, I'm sure occasionally, somehow, some way, they get around, right? Maybe some squirrel accidentally hops in the back of a pickup truck when someone's leaving WVSU's campus and makes its way to the Kanawha State Forest, and then boom, they've had some exchange. But generally speaking, that's rarely or never happens, right? And such isolation is common in populations confined to different lakes or islands. I'm not going to ask you that, but that is a good example. And this will be a little bit more important later, right? So the point here is just because they're the same species doesn't mean they're the same population. Because if they're not together, if they're not interbreeding, if they're not dealing with the same problems, if they're not competing for the same resources, we don't consider them a population. And here's a picture from your old textbook as an example. See, you have all these different lakes. So there's probably, I don't know, some trout, maybe not trout, maybe there's a bass, some species of bass that lives in this lake, and the same species of bass lives in this lake, and the same species of bass lives in this lake, and that lake, and that lake, right? They're the same species, but they're not the same population because they don't interact with each other. They're not breeding with each other. Don't get me wrong, just like I said on the previous slides, sometimes something could happen, right? You could have some guy who's fishing here, right? And his buddy's fishing over there. He catches the fish from over here, walks over to his buddy, and says, hey, look at this fish I caught. He's like, oh, it's too small. You got to throw it back. So when he throws it back here instead of here, right? So in that case, you did get a fish from one population going to the other. But generally speaking, they're different populations because mostly they don't interact. Now, your book's not making this point, but while we're talking about it, I'll go ahead and bring this up. So imagine the water level used to be higher. Imagine this didn't used to be a bunch of little lakes. Imagine this used to be one big lake with one population of the species of bass, for example. Then the water levels drop. Now all of a sudden, like your book is saying, we have different areas, right? So this is now different populations of these fish. Therefore, they're all dealing with different situations, right? This might be a really deep cold lake. This one might be a really shallow, warm lake. This lake might have some really big predators in it. This lake might have relatively no predators in it, right? So all these different populations of the same species of fish are dealing with different things. Therefore, over time, natural selection is going to act in different ways, right? So over time, these populations that used to be the same species eventually might become different species. Your book wasn't making that point at this point, but I'm just bringing this back from one of our first conversations when we were talking about allopatric speciation. Remember, that's when populations are separated by geography and they're faced with different environmental conditions. Therefore, over time, they might become different species. Anyway, here's another word you need to know for sure. Gene pool. What is a gene pool? Gene pool consists of all copies of every type of allele in every locus and all members of the population. So you guys know what a genome is, right? That used to be that's not really a scientific word anymore. I think most people know what a genome is, right? So if you were to look at your genome, it's all your genes, right? Well, a gene pool is like a step up from that. The gene pool is like the genome. It's all the genomes of everybody in that population. So you need to know what a gene pool is. The reason we're talking about it, as you can see from that first bullet point, is because at the population level, biologists focus on the gene pool. And you do too, for your lab this week, right? You were looking at the gene pool of those fish, right? You were looking at the alleles that made them light or orange versus white, or if they were mixed, they would have, with spots. You were looking at the gene pool. Of course, you were only focused on one type of allele, right? Or one type of gene, right? Two different alleles for one gene. But yes, that's what a gene pool is. make sure you know, whoops. Oh, come on. Make sure you know what a gene pool is for the exam. Analyzing gene pools. We should be able to go through this very quickly because this is exactly what you did in lab. So imagine a wildflower population that has two varieties of blooms that are different colors, right? So let's just imagine we've got this population of flowers that comes in two varieties. It's either red or white, right? Let's just say hypothetically that the allele for the red flower is dominant, the allele for the white flower is recessive. Now the genotype frequencies can be calculated from the allele frequencies if the gene pool is stable, which means it's not evolving. Now that's a big if, and in all these conversations, we're just going to assume this is always true. If the gene pool is stable, but I'm going to put a line through it, just indicating that that's usually not the case. We're only assuming this is the case for this conversation. And that brings us to the Hardy-Weinberg formula, which in my opinion might be the hardest part of the exam. But it can be made easy. Now, when we do this in real biology in higher level classes, it is complicated because we actually do use that formula the same way you would use a formula in an algebra class, right? Where you're factoring and solving for P, solving for Q, things like that. But in this class, we don't have to do that. Here's what you need to know. Here's what you need to know. When we're talking about the Hardy-Weinberg formula, there's basically two versions of it, at least as far as we're concerned. There's the one that gives you the allele frequencies, and the one that gives you the genotype frequencies. So first we'll talk about the genotype frequencies. How many of you have dimpled chins? 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. 4. I don't. She doesn't. So 4 out of 6. I'm not going to do the actual math, but let's just say that there's 10 of us, and 4 of you had dimpled chins, right? So that would mean that's the dominant phenotype. Of course, it could be heterozygous too. Let's just assume 2 of you were, right? Let's assume there's 10 of us. Let's assume 10 of you, 2 of you have the homozygous dominant. You've got a chin dimple, right? 2 of you also have the chin dimple, but you're heterozygous. And then, what did I say? 10, right? So we're sitting 6 of us. Actually, I won't even do that. There we go. I don't want to do the full math. We don't have time. We're running out of time. Maybe we'll come back to this. We only have 3 minutes. Let me leave you with this. What you need to know for the exam is this: P squared. Whenever you see this in the exam or whatever, P squared means that's the number or the percentage of dominant homozygotes. I do it like this instead. Let's say 20% of the population of the world, and I'm just making this up, 20% of the population is homozygous dominant for dimple chin. Let's say 20% of the population is heterozygous for dimple chin. And here's the basic math you might have to do. If that's the case, if I told you that, then what percent is recessive homozygous? Basic math here, don't overthink it. If 20% are homozygous dominant, if 20% are heterozygous, then how many must be homozygous recessive?
60.
Good. I don't know if you guys are paying attention, but yes, the answer is 60, right? Because 20 plus 20 is 40. Therefore, it would have to be 60, right? Because all together, it has to be 100%. And of course, in this case, we don't write it as percentages, we write it as decimals. But yes, that must be 60%. And that's the kind of basic math you might have to do on the exam, right? I might give it to you and say, X percent is this percent is that, so therefore, how many must be this? I'll give you more examples when we get back. The last word for attendance will be dominant. Again, you guys know what to do if you're watching live or if you're here right now, but if you're watching the video later, send a screenshot of me playing at the word dominant. You guys have a good weekend. I'll see you on Monday. For some of you, I'll see you today, because some of you are retaking the third exam.
I was gonna ask you to take the exam, but I didn't know that they had us leaving. They have us leaving at, I think it's 11 o'clock.
Now, I was saying earlier in the week that you have a schedule with me, because even today I've got people scheduled all the way up to 5 p.m.
Yeah.
So you might have to do the other retake where it's like, next week people are going to be able to retake it the way they used to, where you just jump on, it's open book, it's not time, but it'll be an average of your first grade.
I'll be able to do that then.
All right, good luck on your trip.
Thank you.